Let's get peppy. This is PEP 98, a special midweek PEP with the one, the only, Associate Professor Dr. Brendon O'Connor. Hello, Brendon.
Good to see you, Chad. It's great to see you, in fact.
It's great to see you as well. Now, I got to say, Brendon, I actually Googled you, to be honest, to see if you spell your first name with an A-N or an O-N when I was writing out that you were coming. I guess people confuse that kind of thing. And I was shocked to discover just how many Brendon O'Connors there are on Google, both A-N and O-N. Does that annoy you? You must be the most common name on earth. There are a million famous Brendon O'Connors.
Probably the most common name in a small part of Ireland, I'd say. Yeah, I think the A is the dominant approach, the Dan rather than the Don. But yes, a source of many an email spelling error. So I just go by B.
Sure. Well, look, for those who want to pass a long night, entertain themselves on Google, do look up both Brendon O'Connor and Brendon O'Connor. You'll be astonished by how many there are. By the way, Brendon, if you want to, Brendan Licciardello, I don't think there are any of in the world. So yeah, just think about it.
I'll keep it in mind.
Before we get on to business, there is something which is very important I follow up on from last week, because I was astonished when just at a passing fancy, I asked Dr. Dave if the US Study Center, you are from the US Study Center as well, were the Avengers, which Avenger he would be. And he said he had never even watched the Avengers. So I put to you, Dr. Brendon, which Avenger would Dave be and which Avenger would you be?
Oh, this is so glorious. I've never watched it either, so I don't have to, make an embarrassment of myself, pretend to, make myself the villain and him the good guy or whatever it is. But no,
what are you
Avengers
guys doing?
Free Zone, the US Study Center. We're all reading G. Gordon Liddy's will or, watching the latest Ken Burns series. So no time for the Avengers.
I always wondered how Dr. Dave got to read as many books as he reads. And this is now becoming clear that you guys just, you read, you don't watch. The Avengers is the #1 export out of America these days, as far as I can see. I was
superheroes, Avengers, it's all the same to me.
Okay, well, look, for the record, I never said what I thought Dr. Dave would be. One of our viewers sent through a comment saying exactly what I was thinking, though, which was that Dr. Dave would definitely be the Hulk. Because, he's a bit nerdy, he's a bit geeky, but you would not like to make Dr. Dave mad. When he gets mad, he's very powerful. So that's my take. We'll find out which Avenger you are by the end of this podcast, undoubtedly. But look, first of all, tell us what you do, because I just get these people on and no one knows why I've got these people on. Tell us your specialties, tell us what you're working on, and we'll move the podcast around that.
Sure thing. So I'm one of those lucky people who's able to turn a hobby into a job. I think I first started studying American history and politics at high school, where I had a fantastic teacher in a very small town in New Zealand called Gisborne, who was fascinated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. So we did 6 months of history on the New Deal, and then we moved on to the beheading of Charles the First.
Was your teacher Bernie Sanders?
he would have got on well with Bernie Sanders. So that set me off to university studying American history, American politics, and I've written my first book I wrote was on the American welfare system, a history. Many people said that would be a very short study, unkindly. And then I started writing a lot about anti-Americanism. As soon as George W. Bush was elected, I had some bad feelings that the rest of the world wasn't going to warm to him. And I was working on this topic before September 11, and I'd worked very briefly in the World Trade Center. I'd been doing a project with some people on drug use in the amongst people who were arrested during the zero tolerance period, where Giuliani was mayor of New York. And my job was to go to the Bronx Criminal Court and interview people about what kind of drugs they'd use for a survey we were doing for the Justice Department. And I could offer them a candy bar and then I'd have to get a urine sample at the end. So that was the only time I ever got my fingers sort of dirty as an academic or as a researcher, and I have been scurried back to reading books and keeping out of prisons ever since. And then recently I've been writing a lot about American foreign policy, a series of books about the various misadventures of Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and I'm trying to encapsulate at the moment how you might describe the Trump presidency. What were the big ideas behind his foreign policy? And that's, led me into want to work with a bunch of colleagues on this topic. I think we're going to talk about it a bit today, of how much longer America has to last as a democracy. Some people would say it's never been a democracy, but I'm a little more generous than that. I think it has many of the features of democracy, if somewhat fused with entertainment and a special kind of hype often. But yeah, the future of American democracy is something I want to work on over the next couple of years, because it strikes me that if America no longer is really a functioning democracy, the world we live in is going to be a lot less palatable and a lot less interesting. And I usually go to America once a year when I can, and that's going to be a real bummer. I'm not really going to want to go if it's an authoritarian state.
Well, that's the biggest problem right there, I think.
Compromise. And I feel for my friends and the sort of the rest of the history of civilization probably rests on. The next election is always described as the most important in American history or in our lifetime, but I tend to think if Donald Trump is elected again, it possibly will be the most important election of my lifetime. Global warming will be accelerated once again as well.
Well, let's talk about the democracy thing, because as you said, you're working on this at the moment. You sent me, for my own homework benefit, an article to read, which I will put in the reading list below if you want to have a look at the article in the New York Times that Dr. Brendon recommended. And it's a great article. I would recommend it as well about this particular topic. I've certainly thought of some things to talk about with this. So why don't you start telling us about this situation that we're facing?
Yeah, it's an article by David Lionheart from the New York Times opinion pages he usually sort of writes for. And it's really just a sort of nice overview for those who follow American politics, maybe not on an hourly basis like ourselves, Chaz, but, come back and forth to it, binge around elections, but then sort of have a bit of a break from it to detox, and then come back. He really outlines the big concerns, the big threats to American democracy at the moment, the sort of looming question of, will Republicans, even at the midterms, accept defeat? Is the sense of, has one political party in America decided that democracy is a good thing as long as you win? And when you don't win, democracy is a pretty bad idea. And even the sort of mumbo jumbo arguments that, well, the founding fathers didn't really have that much faith in democracy. That's why they had all these electors and weird sub-clauses to the electoral system called the Electoral College. And so this kind of anti-democratic spirit that you see particularly being played out in the last election through pressure being put on various secretaries of state, in Georgia particularly, to get them to send another slate of electors and overturn the popular will. That really looms as a train crash that we can see. We can see all the features of it. We know how Trump or someone like Trump might try to subvert American democracy, because he tried it last time round, and they're trying to make those mechanisms possibly easier in the future. So the coup or the anti-democratic, authoritarian kind of overthrow of American democracy, all the features of it are lay out in front of us. So it'd be pretty ignorant to ignore them and say, oh, no, she'll be right. America will go on. I've seen the Statue of Liberty, and it's always going to be like it is. I think that would be an extremely optimistic, bordering on fantasy kind of like thinking. So I'm in the pessimist camp. this stuff really worries me, because I think it is a real looming disaster.
Those who watch or listen to this podcast will know that this is a pet area of mine as well. One of the stats that David Leinhardt referred to, which I thought was interesting, was that, I mean, we know this generally, but the number is interesting. 47% of Republican candidates running for statewide office this year refused to accept the 2020 result. So it's about half. Now they didn't all win, but still, it's an indication of at least one side being less willing to accept the result. We've talked about this a lot, but David Leinhardt, he didn't just end there. He had a lot of other concerns as well. Unless you have more to say about this particular, I mean, we kind of know.
I think the other stat that jumped out at me is that 67% of Democrats and Republicans think that America will not be a functioning democracy into the future. And the last time I saw a survey on that, I think it was a Yahoo survey about 2 months ago, the figure was 50%. So, this concern is rising of more Americans are thinking, well, democracy isn't a great system, or we're not going to have it in the future. Why do we worry about it? Or, it's under great threat. In some degree, this may be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. That people might think, well, we've done our democracy time, and now we might try something new.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I'd say it's, I mean, number one, that's one of the very few things Republicans and Democrats seem to agree on, which is a shame that that's the thing they agree on. But also, I think one of the problems, because I actually have a number of problems that I see that David Leinhardt didn't mention. One of them, which I'd mention, is a sense of decline. America has a very strong sense of decline at the moment. And it's not just democracy. I actually think the democracy aspect is one manifestation of a greater issue, which is that for instance, I'll quote a YouGov poll, that 55% of Democrats and 56% of Republicans, once again, they agree on this, say that America won't be a global superpower within a decade. Like, now that's ridiculous. Like, even if China and India just rushed past America, it wouldn't happen in 10 years. 10 years is just a blink of the eye.
That's sort of old Jeremiah of American sort of decline, straight after the 19 sort of, 40s, when the Soviet Union starts to kick in and recover from World War II, there's modeling saying, well, these planned society is going to overtake us within 10 years. Yeah. They've put a dog in space. What will be next? They'll have a colony, a socialist colony on the moon. Yeah. So that sense of pessimism has always been there. Is the flip side of the over-exaggerated sense of exceptionalism and greatness. That there's been a brittleness, as there is often with people as well. Yeah. You talk too much about yourself and your triumphs, and you usually got a pretty fragile ego.
I can't imagine who you're talking about there. Just to add to the unrealistic nature of it, like America's average income is like 4 times China's. Russia's economy is basically the size of Australia's. Like they're not going to be passing America anytime soon. But it's not just that. Also, I mean, as you say, this is part of just America's mindset going back some period, I guess. But also, in the same poll, 48% of Republicans said it was likely that the government would confiscate citizens' firearms in the next decade. That's compared to 17% of Democrats. 49% of Republicans said there would be a total breakdown of law and order. And for those pointing to the 2020 riots, that's not a total breakdown of law and order. That's a riot on a day in 8 cities. That's not the entire country falling to pieces like that poll would suggest. And 41% of Republicans say the US will be invaded by a foreign country, compared to 24% of Democrats. America is never going to be invaded by a foreign country. It wasn't even in World War II invaded by a foreign country. That's not going to be happening in the next decade. But anyway, the reason I brought that up is I think when you have a sense of decline, and I think even though it's, like you say, it's a perpetual element in America, I think it's getting greater, the sense of decline. If you have a sense of decline, I think that raises the stakes for everyone and makes them more willing to break rules and to take shortcuts, democratic shortcuts, because they go, well, like they get desperate. They go, it's all over. We got to do something now or it's the end, which I think spurs, we'll talk more about this a little bit down the track, but I think it spurs authoritarianism because people feel that the stakes are high and you've got nothing to lose because America's going down the gurgler anyway. So I think that's another problem myself, like as well.
Well, it spurs on the idea that you need a savior.
Yeah.
You know, there's a sense of America wanting a savior in the 1950s. I mean, McCarthy put himself forward. Kennedy, of course, put himself forward. Nixon, in his own way, in 1960, put himself forward as the sort of a strange kind of savior of America. And then Reagan in the late 70s, and then in the 80 election, puts him forward as this great savior of America that's been in decline in the late 70s. And so that sense of wanting, as you say, a shortcut, a kind of fantasy out of the sense of malaise is, I think, very common in American history. And that's, in his own way, that's what Donald Trump has offered, that he's not what everyone else is before him, certainly, and he's a completely different leader, and he will make America great again, by hook or by crook.
Well, I was going to say, I always think the quote that says it all about Trump is "I alone can fix it," which I remember he said. I think that was he said that during the campaign. I think he also said in his first speech as well as president, "I alone can fix it." I thought that summed up the mindset quite worryingly and well. But, Leinhardt also noticed, and we talked about something which we've discussed a little bit on this podcast, but not as much as Leinhardt did. He really went into detail about the problem when the majority doesn't have control in a democracy, when it's a rule by minority. And he went into some detail about the way the system is set up, not by evildoers, but the way the system is set up does lead to, at least recently, in the last 20 years or so, the minority very consistently having more power, or at least disproportionate power, than they should according to their population. And over time, that wears a democracy down. Would you like to talk to that at all? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see it on the issue of abortion rights. We see it maybe in the Supreme Court decision on environmental protections, where the willingness for those to increase is going up, but the court can come in, the ability to stop things with the filibuster. So I think that sense that, I mean, my sense is that democracies really have to have a strong sense that if you get the majority, you get to put your platform into action, and then you should be, voted on in 3 or 4 years or 6 years' time, how that platform went in practice. And when you don't have that as a process for politics, politics largely becomes symbolic. That you pretend that you're going to do a bunch of things, and then you argue about why you didn't do them. A lot of the time, that's how American politics plays out. So I think, there is, I mean, it's very structural. I mean, my sense of it, it's in the nature of the Senate being the way it's elected, every 2 senators from each state, the ability of the filibuster, the power of the Supreme Court in so many areas, the gerrymandered system at the House level. There's a lot of things that cut against majoritarian politics. And this doesn't sort of, I think, in the end, speak well for democracy. I think if you're going to design a new democracy on, the planet orb that we colonize, it would have to be one where I think majoritarianism largely wins the day with some safeguards built in. But a minimal safeguards through a court system or something.
Leinhardt, when you talk about the Senate, Leinhardt made the point, which once again, we've all heard before, but he had the numbers, that in 1790, the largest state was Virginia, and they had about 13 times as many residents as the smallest state, which was Delaware. And today, California has 68 times as many residents as Wyoming, 53 times as many people as Alaska, 20 times as many as another 11 states, yet they all have the same representation in the Senate, which is what you're going to. The other point he made at the presidential level is the nature of winner-take-all elections plays a role as well, because once again, this is not from any evil doing. This is just how it's panned out. It just so happens at the moment, California Biden won by 29 points. New York, Biden won by 23 points. Illinois won by 17 points. That's a lot of votes wasted in the Democratic states. And that is the reason why the Democrats keep on winning the majority, but not necessarily winning the election, because there's all these wasted votes because of the winner-take-all nature of states in the presidential election, which I think
he's got a nice graphic on this. A bunch of balls that move around depending on which election cycle it is, showing that from the elections being much narrower in terms of the range early on, say the 1988 election, that over time the range has become more extreme. Republicans are winning by bigger majorities in a small number of areas, and the Democrats in those big states like California winning very sizable majorities. So you've got a significant amount of wasted votes. So you need a degree of proportional representation in there. Ideally, I think, you need, maybe if you're going to keep with this strange electoral college, the electoral college sort of gives out votes on the basis of proportion. That I think would be an interesting formula for each state, and each state, as I think you've talked about on your podcast, there's a mechanism for a number of states to do this that would, maybe not require a constitutional amendment, which would be incredibly hard to get through.
Absolutely. And the same thing goes with at the congressional level as well. You mentioned gerrymandering, where people rig the boundary lines to favor the incumbent, and Republicans are doing that more than Democrats at the moment, but just for whatever reason. But on top of that, just the natural boundary lines of what they call the big sort, that Democrats these days are gathering in the cities and Republicans are gathering in rural areas. And that means you get these urban electorates with massive, massive results for Democrats, which is, once again, wasted votes in Congress. So in 2020, this is from David Leinhardt as well, only 21 Republican House candidates won their elections by at least 50 percentage points, but 47 Democrats did. And by the way, and the point he makes is that all these things line up so that the Democrats are getting screwed at the moment. But throughout history, the last 200 years, that hasn't happened before, where all the structural factors have lined up favoring the same side in a way like this. But this is what's new. It's just an accident of history. It's just turned out like this. But the result,
I think it's easy to gerrymander these, a lot of Democrat sort of areas because of this concentration. I think concentrations, you can have these Texas seats that we've seen that almost run the state of Texas and try to find every Hispanic voter that lives in a rural area and clump them together and then try to win all the seats around them that you had, and that you've got an extraordinary district in Texas that almost goes from the top to the bottom. That sort of thing. But that is more open to being thrown out at courts as a non-really, contiguous, it's not a community. That when you're doing that sort of thing. So I think Republicans, as you sort of look at, this issue of who you're going to send as the electors after the next presidential election and gerrymandering, have really been much more organized at the state level. It's almost like Democrats have been studying the issues and Republicans have been studying the voting mechanisms and the ways of getting elected, and that's all they've concentrated on, and they've been pretty good at it. So I'd see it as a little more than an accident. I think that they've really honed in on how they can concentrate a minority having a majority of power, or in, say, states like Ohio, where they've had a pretty 50-50 split for quite a long time, working out how you can turn that into a 60-40, or in place like Wisconsin, and that's turning those 50-50 states where they switch presidential elections, they switch governors between Republicans and Democrats, but somehow the Republicans are getting 65% of the reps and the Democrats are getting 35. That's the dark arts. That's when you're engaging in gerrymandering in a very creative way that you're maximizing your influence. And that's one of the things that makes it hard for the Democrats to maintain a majority in the House in this upcoming midterm elections.
to be clear, when I say it's an accident in history, I don't mean gerrymandering. That's very much not an accident in history. I mean the structural factors we were referring to before, like the winner-take-all nature of the presidency, etc., of the presidential states, etc. Like but no, there's no doubt that the rigging of elections through gerrymandering is very intentional. The other point I'd make about the big sort, because I think that's a really big factor in the last 20 years, like that Democrats gathering in cities, Republicans gathering in rural areas, is that there's something which I read about called the law of group polarization. And what that posits is that when like-minded individuals gather together and stay in each other's company, they tend to become more extreme because they bounce off each other. And so if you have a situation where Democrats are increasingly gathering together and Republicans are increasingly gathering together, I think it leads to greater polarization. In particular, negative polarization, hating the other side as well, which I think is one of the features of our time as well, which I think also goes to creates more problems in the situation we're in at the moment and makes people more likely to want to take shortcuts and screw over the other side. Which I think
it's sort of, I think there's survey evidence now that marriage, is less and less likely every few years to go across Democrats and Republicans. Republicans are marrying Republican voting people and Democrats Democrat voting people, and that's just part of this cultural sorting, which the sort of urban, rural, exurbs kind of element of the American society really allows it. It was a book I read on this quite about 10, 15 years ago, Bill Bishop's book, that sort of gives you that title, The Big Sort. And that was, I think people have been on to this for about 15 years or so of saying this is where America was heading in terms of like-minded people being and living in like-minded places with the coffee shops and bars and restaurants and cinemas that they like, or monster car venues or whatever it was. That sense, one of the great things about visiting America is if you're a complete fanatic for mountain biking or craft beer or whatever it is, you've got a community of people there that you can connect with that is by Australian standards extraordinary. So the sort of niche culture was always, I think, a factor of America just on the basis of size. But with the internet and movement and people are seemingly in these, almost kind of satirized, sort of Portlandia places all over the United States where they're, living with people more and more like themselves.
Yeah. Let me throw a couple more at you, specific reasons why America might be in trouble, because I've thought a lot about this. The next thing I would say is a growing willingness to blatantly flout the rules. And what I'm referring to there is things like, for instance, well, we saw one just now, in my view, which was Biden with his student loan reform, using as an excuse COVID for why he could overrule Congress, saying that because it was an emergency period because of COVID, he could skip past Congress and just unilaterally waive trillions of dollars worth of, not trillions, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of loans. That would normally be a congressional power to do, but he used an emergency to do it. Trump did the same thing with the wall, that Congress specifically did not give him funding for the wall, but he misappropriated defense funds because of an emergency to do that. And I'm saying, at least recently, especially with Trump and Biden, I'm seeing a lot more of this kind of shortcutting, where you come up with these pretexts to just do what you want to do, working around the way the system's meant to work, which only pisses off the other side and makes them more likely to do the same back to you. And
but I mean, given the nature of the Congress and the filibuster, Obama did this a lot with executive orders as well. They were vastly increased during his 8 years.
Yeah.
Trump, used every opportunity where he could when he came in on trade, immigration, EPA regulations, where the wand could be waved, it increasingly is, because there are so many things that you can't get through legislatively. So I mean, is it entirely surprising? We've got a very broken a legislative system in terms of the Congress, that the executive doesn't follow traditions of how it might get things done. It just wants to, there's an authoritarian element to this, clearly. But it's basically saying we were elected as the executive, as a president. People expect us to do something. We're gonna try to do some things.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's not a surprise. It's just an observation. In particular, because I'm a bit of a history student as well, and to me, there's echoes of the late Roman Republic in that, when increasingly their governments were coming up with really lame pretexts to just do whatever they wanted, and to the point where laws became essentially meaningless, and it became a case of, okay, well, if you want to stop me, you stop me with power. And that's when things started to really fall apart at that point in time. But anyway, I need to reset the Zoom because we're on a very cheap Zoom connection as per usual. But I am just going to flag, when we come back from the white flash, I think we should talk a little bit more about authoritarianism in general, because I think there's a lot of it happening. And I think that is central to this particular issue. Right back after the white flash. So first of all, do you actually agree with me, Dr. Brendon, that authoritarianism is growing? And I don't just mean on the right either. I mean generally, and not just in America either. I would say generally around the world. And why do you think that is, if you agree with me?
I do agree with you. I had a chance to have some sense of thinking without you guiding me, Chaz. I was very confused at the beginning of this podcast when you were talking about the Avengers, and I'm thinking, but that's a British show. That's a 1951 British show. What is he talking about? One of America's greatest exports. I'm thinking, well, it's his show. I don't want to be, kind of a pedant or anything. I'll kind of let it roll from the top, and but clearly, with the advantages of Google, I'm able to restore my memory and think that I'm not totally losing it.
So you are so out of the world of current pop culture that you think of the Avengers not as the movie series, but the 1960s British spy TV show.
Yeah, totally. That's me. I'm like happy that's the high point of culture for me. Reginald Perrin and the Beatles, and I do have if people listen to my T-shirt, this is my only sort of bit of popular culture I'll give into. It's I was thinking people would probably think it's my own drawing that I'd put on my own shirt, because that's probably about the level of my art. But it is actually reference to a 1990s band.
Well, that's very up to date.
That's about as relevant as I get culturally. But anyway, back to authoritarianism, and not to bore the listener. I agree with you, and I think Lionheart has a whole bunch of stats about how the number of authoritarian states has been increasing in recent years, and that great hope of the 1990s that more and more states were democratizing, that we see a real democratic decline globally on that. I think if you look at the American data on this, and the person whose name will come to me in a minute, who's been looking at this, Stanley Feldman from SUNY University, he's been looking at the Stony Brook in New York, and he's shown that the public opinion, particularly in the Republican Party, that is favorable towards authoritarianism has really been increasing over the last 20 years. That there's good data on this, that what you might call the authoritarian personality, which was, for some scholars of the Nazi period, crucial to why Hitler was able to get so much support. These two fancy writers by the name of Adorno and Horkheimer had this theory that was a crucial part of the popularity of Hitler's Nazi Germany and of his Nazi party, and that as we see that tendency to support authoritarian leaders and ideas and approaches on the rise in America in public opinion. So, yeah, total agreement we're in on this issue.
Yeah, I'd argue though that while there's no doubt that it is primarily on the right at the moment. I think there's plenty of at least the mindset of an authoritarian on the left as well. Let me just put to you a chain of logic, which I see all the time in my reading from all people. I know you're not meant to both sides these kinds of things, but let me just read you some logical steps and tell me if this is familiar to you. Number one, the other side is stupid, selfish, hypocritical, corrupt, and hell-bent on ruining this country. Number two, our side is spineless, out of touch, and a prisoner of procedural niceties that don't matter. Number three, our side doesn't realize just how historically bad things are right now and how we're on the very precipice of extreme danger if we don't win this battle. Number four, our opponents are shameless and will break any rule or moral in their pursuit of power. Number five, following on from the other four, whatever it takes to win is justified. Any institution standing in the way can be demolished, and doing anything less amounts to you being a phony, a coward, weak, and suspect in your commitment to the cause of what's right. I see that all the time on any issue. Like it's just especially on social media. And it just, to me, that is the logic of an authoritarian, that the other side is so bad, it justifies the means. Where like the ends justify the means because the other side is historically bad. They are so bad. And that's what links to the negative polarization I said before, where you hate the other side more than you like your own. Which that worries me, because I think, I feel like that's very bad in America, but I feel like that's spreading everywhere. I think partly it's probably by social media, because I think a lot of us import the logic of Americans because it just dominates the world so much, America.
Well, it's being on Facebook, isn't it? Or being on Twitter or whatever it is. You'd see more and more things that you self-selectingly want to see, and you get outraged about the same things that a bunch of people like you are outraged about. And so that, working at a university can be like that sometimes. People telling you what are the things that you should be outraged about. And some of these things are outrageous and are terrible from my perspective as well. But I'm with you on procedures, that you can't just say, I have all the right views, we have all the right views, and let's just, march down and tear the whole system apart to achieve these ends. I mean, I think the other commonality that I've been studying in terms of sort of extreme politics is this idea that there's a sort of overbearing managerial class that's running our societies. That we're run by what the sort of conservatives for a long time called a new class. Some Marxist podcasts I listen to, have this kind of idea of this overviewing sort of managerial class. Even my friend I'm going to talk about later on, who died recently, Barbara Enright, she wrote a bit about this. There's elements of the Trumpian right which talk about the administrative state, the administrative class, and this idea that every bureaucrat and every kind of expert is to be sort of blamed for where we're at. This really can go a little clearly too far. And it's not an exclusively right-wing view or an exclusively left-wing view, but on the extremes of both movements, there is a sense of, if only you could get the genuine voice of this sort of underheard class of, in the case on the extreme left, of academics who haven't been heard enough, or on the right, sort of rural populists or Trumpians who have believed they've been cut out of politics for so long. But this idea that there's this unrepresented group out there who have all the answers, or at least a better way of doing things, this isn't exclusively a conservative position at the moment. We can see, you can see that in radical politics of a variety of shades going on.
Given that you're a lecturer, I would actually be interested in your take on something else as well in this realm, which is, I don't have the numbers on me. I didn't have time to do a poll dive, but I just take it from me. I hate when people say that. As someone who looks at a lot of polls, I do have a very strong sense of, whenever there's a poll involving either authoritarianism or a demise of liberal values like free speech or free religion or things like that, there's a tendency for the young to be more authoritarian than the middle-aged people. Like the 20s to 30s tend to be significantly, in my view, more authoritarian in these polls than the 40s to 50s, generally speaking. And it's an interesting development because that's not how it used to be. And I wonder why that might be. I did read an article, which I found interesting, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I just want to read you a quote from this article and see what your take is, and whether A, you agree, and B, if you might have another reason as someone who actually deals with the 20-somethings or on a daily basis. This is the quote. Yeah, I'll put the article in the reading list below as well in the homework. Delving into the interlocking histories of print, Christianity, and democracy, Adam Garfinkel argued that all three of these combine to create a particular type of subject well suited to democratic governance. He suggests the principal means by which such democratic subjects were shaped was long-form reading. Long-form reading builds up an interlinked base of knowledge held in long-term memory that you can use to think with. But sustained engagement with long-form text also creates the capacity for abstract thinking, inner life as such, and a shared belief in objective standards and the value of deliberation. Even today, there are striking overlaps between worldwide literacy and nations that embrace some form of democracy, which correlates strongly with the prevalence of Christian belief. Today, though, a nation founded in the convergence of Christianity, literacy, and democracy sees Christianity in rapid decline, as is the case across the West. Garfinkel argues that literacy is not far behind, for while on the face of it, we're reading and writing more than ever, in another sense, we're losing the central print era capacity for deep reading. In its place, prolonged engagement with scrolling, intertextual, and interactive reading rewards us for losing unitary focus and trains us not to concentrate but filter torrents of information via rapid-fire skipping across multiple sources. The result is a shift towards continuous partial attention. If deep reading produced democracy as its governing political form, what can we expect to see associated with its networked digital successor? As Garfinkel sees it, this would probably be towards a less abstract, repersonalized form of social and political authority concentrated in a great authoritarian leader. Now, I don't quite know how Christianity fits into this. I guess Christianity has a sense of objective truth, and it's very anti-relativism, and whataboutism and stuff is a kind of relativism. I kind of get that, but so I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that. But especially the deep reading aspect versus how we all read today, skipping through stuff. Do you think that that's played any role at all, or do you think it's just bullshit?
Oh no, as someone who can barely use the internet, this appeals to me greatly. There was one of the studies I was doing on American knowledge of global geography, current affairs, comparing it to other nations. Pew have got a fair bit of data on this, particularly National Geographic did some good surveys on this. Americans were, as the sort of cliches go, pretty terrible at sort of placing countries on a world map. There's this kind of quip that, God invented wars so Americans could learn geography. That did help in some regards with Iraq and Afghanistan, that you saw an increase in where Americans realizing where these countries were. But it was the Northern Europeans, particularly the Germans and the Swedes, that were excellent. On a blank map, they could name lots of countries. They could name all the sort of previous leaders of the UN, the Secretary Generals, all sorts of world leaders around the world. And one of the correlations, apart from knowing a few languages and how much news you read in the newspaper, was the people who read the most long form stuff had the greatest knowledge of this basic current affairs, geography. It stuck in a way maybe it doesn't stick if you're not engaged with these things. So I think, on the broader point of, where are young people at today, I greatly enjoy that part of my job of teaching younger students. And, that's something been a great joy throughout my career. But I have a lot of arguments with my son, Finnegan, who's 18, and he's, not particularly taken by American democracy as it stands. So that sense of, why wouldn't something else be a better approach? Why, when this is failing, why wouldn't you reach to more extreme, be it authoritarian or revolutionary solutions? Because what we've got now is clearly, keeping very many people, poor, very unequally sort of distributed wealth, and, prejudices and all sorts of things. So I think that sense maybe in the polling that you're seeing, amongst younger people that things are screwed. Things are sort of cracked for a lot of people. The future isn't that bright. You're not going to be able to own your own house unless you make certain compromises about what you do in life in terms of study or learning or career. Those things I think make people more open to less liberal democratic solutions than, old people like you and I might find comforting and think, well, in the end, it's a better system. If you don't have a very optimistic view of the future, I think, why wouldn't you want to reach to more authoritarian or revolutionary solutions?
That's an excellent point. If democracy sucks, people look for alternatives. That's fair.
I think some people who look at this democracy question, not me, I tend to look at the structures and the arguments that we've been going through. But some people would say, well, put the issues to the front. What are the issues that make people have a sense that democracy isn't working? Put inequality as a sort of much more important sort of up this chain of issues that we're looking at, not electoral integrity. Maybe if you're a conservative, put, political correctness or whatever it is up the list of, what's the most important problem here. So I tend to start with the structures, because I think unless you've got a system which, the person who gets the most votes actually gets to become president, that's going to be a problem for everything. But not, there are a lot of people that see the issues as the first thing to think about.
Music to my ears, Brendon. I love structuralists. I'm a structuralist too. My final thought in this area was going to lead to the next thing I know you want to talk about, which is that, just so this is my personal observation, might be incredibly wrong, but it seems to me that the left and the right in America are polarizing in different ways, and they're clashing because they're polarizing in weird ways. In that, I feel like the left is polarizing on the issues, which you just mentioned, in that the left is moving to the left quite rapidly, I feel. The right, I don't think is moving to the right rapidly at all. In fact, I think they're if anything, they've moved slightly to the left in the last little while, but they're moving rapidly temperamentally. The left aren't moving temperamentally, they're moving on issues. The right aren't moving on issues, they're moving temperamentally. And let me describe what I'm referring to there. First of all, there's a graph I'll put up right here. You can't see Dr. Brendon, but the people at home can if you're watching the video feed. If you're watching the audio, well, go and look at the video and you'll see it. It's from The Economist. I don't even know how they do these measurements, but this is the kind of graph I've seen a number of times. In 1994, the average Democrat was at a 5 out of 10 in terms of, and the lower the number, the more liberal, the higher the number, the more conservative. The average Republican was a 6 in 1994. In 2004, the average Democrat was at a 4. They'd moved from 5 to 4, and the average Republican was under 5. So they both moved to the left by 1 point between 1994 and 2004. And then in 2017, the average Democrat was at 2. The average Republican was at 6.5. So over that 30-year period, or 25-year period, the Democrats had moved 4 out of 10 to the left, and the Republicans had moved half out of 10 to the right. That's on the issue. And if that doesn't ring true to you at all, if you go, oh, come on, that's crazy, I put to you, number one, Trump would never even consider things like Social Security reform or Medicare reform, which the Republicans economically were all over only 5 or 10 years earlier. That's just gone out the window, all that economic rationalism. Compare Mitt Romney in 2012 to Mitt Romney in 2022. Mitt Romney in 2012 was a severely conservative guy who wanted to get rid of entitlements and all this kind of stuff. And in 2022, he's proposing child tax payments, or child tax rebates and left-wing solutions, like economic solutions. Look at COVID, how much money Republicans were agreed to sink into the economy. That would have been unheard of. In 2008, they were going crazy over $700 billion. During COVID, they were on board with $3 or $4 trillion. So you can see how the Republicans did not at all move to the right during that period. By contrast, the Democrats, I don't think I need to convince anyone, have moved to the left in the last 20 years. But temperamentally, the right have just gone nuts. They've become so much more feral and so much more like they've been playing toesies with neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and they've just been, and there's been a lot more passionate rhetoric about civil wars and grabbing the guns and all this kind of crazy stuff. So to me, those two movements don't coalesce at all. They lead to both sides having more resentment for each other. And the reason why this is relevant to what you were talking about, because I know you want to talk the Claremont Institute, which to me summarizes perfectly an academic institution from the right becoming the conduit of civil war talk. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a little bit about what you've just said, and then talk about the Claremont Institute and my recent, heavy reading on paleoconservatism, which, it is as strange as the term might suggest to some of your listeners, that the sense of sort of issue polarization you're talking about, I think gets back to the sense of there have been a lot of promises, particularly, I think, since the Obama era, that politicians will come along and they will address inequality, they will address, affordability, college affordability, they'll address global warming, and so little of that getting through the Congress under Obama. And then, up until very recently, Biden's agenda looking like it's going to go not going to go very far. So I think that has probably led to a kind of reaching in, as you say, these electorates in the Democratic Party, where there's much more of, I suppose, a kind of conformity, and there's these safe districts which probably have more impact on the actual kind of energy within the party, because those people, guaranteed re-election, they can say whatever they want to some extent, and they become national figures. And we know about, the Ocasio-Cortez's sort of views on things, rather than the people who are marginal and coming in and out of politics. So I think what we understand to be the position of particularly House Democrats is probably not what often gets put into place. What the legislative programs of the parties are still pretty narrow and limited, apart from these emergency measures that you talk about. So I think, a lot of the issue stuff is just still signaling at election time. It's taking symbolic positions on particular issues, which is very easy to do. But a lot of people, I suppose, on the right would say, well, once you overturn Roe v. Wade at the federal level, what's the use of the Christian conservative movement? Is this going to be, when you've achieved a lot of your goals, you've got tax really down at the personal tax level, sometimes movements are kind of don't have that energy once they achieve a lot. So I think on, issues of sort of abortion rights, on taxation, that took some of the real steam out of if the Reagan era is over, maybe it ends this year, because that issue of Roe v. Wade was a central issue that, Reagan wasn't obviously able to achieve. So I think, there's a difference between positioning and achievements.
Yeah, sure.
And I think that, that there's got to be a lot of people in the Christian conservative movement who feel like, they've sort of run their race. They've got the America that they've been wanting since 1973. And that, that the energy is, the issue energy probably is on the left because of a sense of unfulfilled promises and wants. And that, that probably does lead to more extreme tactics or views, or, and I do think there's an age demographic there as well, that you probably are getting Americans moving to the left demographically. People under 30, under 25 have been showing, in general, not across the board. Obviously, there's a culture of alt-right men that cut pretty heavily against us, but in general, a more of a willingness to see a welfare state role for people under 25. You've seen that in Pew surveys for the last 10 so years. Yeah, but the Claremont Institute,
tell me.
That was another reading I brought to you on the basis of being a breeding ground in many regards for the younger people that work for Trump. I mean, one of my really big interests with Trump was who was going to staff the administration. You know, who was going to work for Trump when a lot of the old hands of Republican administrations said, you know, we're part of the Never Trump movement. We're not going to work for this guy. Well, unless he offers me Secretary of State or an ambassadorship.
Sure.
There were people who made those positions and did kind of come back. But, you know, there was a sort of renegade aspect to those who worked for Trump, particularly the sort of at the level of personal assistants and aides. And this Claremont Institute in California, long-standing conservative intellectual movement. I think that would be the fair way to describe it. These are people who take books seriously, people associated with the Claremont movement, like Samuel Francis, wrote a huge book about Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. Now that's, you know, from anyone who's read any part of that book, that's the serious intellectual work. Francis's views on the Leviathan are very quirky and kind of weird in the way that Straussians read, people who follow Leo Strauss read Plato, but it's serious thinking, hard thinking, and that out of that sort of strand of the right, which tended to be anti-immigration, very much sort of ethno-nationalist, pro some government intervention. This was people like Paul Gottfried and Samuel Francis. They're serious thinkers. And what's weird about this is in some ways they're the most serious thinkers on the right, or the people who at least can write the most sort of voluminous books with the most footnotes to Western philosophy. In some ways, their views align the best with Donald Trump's views. That these kind of intellectuals of the right actually have quite a lot in common with where Trump ends up on immigration. Trump's kind of rhetoric on global politics is less interventionist, I think, approach to the world than, say, certainly George W. Bush's presidency. It has interesting alignments with the paleo-conservatives and this Claremont Institute.
So you're saying Trump's one of the great thinkers. That's what you're saying.
Well, I'm saying if you want to understand some of the intellectual lineage of this kind of weird turn that American politics has taken, these people provide us some clues and some links. And it's not directly to Trump, but it was to Pat Buchanan, who was a forerunner to Trump. He was a reader and writer. I own a number of Pat Buchanan's books. And this is in this lineage of paleoconservatism. People like Stephen Miller are familiar with this group, Trump's speechwriter. People like Steve Bannon, have connections with the Claremont Institute. So the ideas, filter through in very bastardized and very unusual ways. But it also provided this kind of, the ground troops who worked in the Trump administration, who carried the bags, who did the scheduling, who, maybe wrote some of the speeches, who, were the assistants. These people, some of them had worked as interns at this wacky kind of institute in California that, is all about Western civilization and the Iron Age or Bronze Age or whatever it might be, and completely ludicrous kind of theories of the fall of civilization being, the rise of the petticoat or something. That they're very strange views about mass, but it all links to this idea of masculinity, of sort of the great sort of white sort of period of the northern man and all of this kind of nonsense. But it gives people some structure for maybe a set of grievances that they had, a kind of intellectual or maybe pseudo-intellectual sort of, structure, some sense of, legitimacy for these ideas.
These guys are the ones that provided John Eastman, who was the brains behind Trump's attempted election overthrow. Like, that's what that's what these guys are.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very kind of, wacky and but dangerous kind of pseudo-intellectual kind of crew. These people are lawyers that were around Trump. They have law degrees and they want to present themselves as constitutional experts, but it's an interpretation that's, you know, incredibly convenient, and you could say incredibly cynical, but it is dressed up in this garb of being learned and scholarly and all of these things that are, you know, a fine institute in the hills of California maybe affords to you,
So,
with oak tables and all the rest of it.
so given you study these guys, have you seen any trends in the stuff they write, which might give us a clue as to where this part of the Republican Party might be going in the future?
I think all the people I was interested in were these kind of scribblers from the 1980s who people just thought, oh my God, you know what? They got this journal, the Claremont Review, and a couple of other journals. They were involved in a journal called the American Conservative, which is a more mainstream sort of anti-war journal, really.
Yeah.
So those journals were, you know, you had to be a real kind of fanatic about American politics to even know about paleoconservatives in the 80s or 90s. So they seemed like they were just on a total loser course. So to believe that these people have somehow got some relevance, and then these new kind of internet, I suppose, based thinkers have got involved and drawing upon these ideas that I mentioned before, the sort of neo-Bronze Age and the Bronze Man and all of this kind of stuff that's in the article we both read.
Yeah. You know, I'll put that in the homework so you can read it as well.
Who could tell the direction of this? But it kind of, I think, ties into what we've been talking about, that it has no love for democracy. It has no great love for process. There's an authoritarian element to it. There's a clearly very racial element to it, a racist, civilizational kind of element. And those things are, you know, all, I suppose that all moves American politics in a direction that I've got little time for and worry about. And this, you know, if there's people being in some ways inculcated into these views about the great white civilization and the great American sort of ethno-nationalism of its kind of early settlers, who were all descendants from some Northman from, you know, Northern Europe and Britain and of Vikings of old. You know, it does just provide the kinds of people who are going to go along, you know, with arguments about, well, we don't really need to accept what the voters said. We can just accept what the governor of, you know, Arizona has sent as their slate of voters. So I think it does prepare a kind of a cadre that might be useful and was useful for Trump. You know, I think these people were pretty unthinking workers for Trump. You know, lots of people could only handle a few years in the Trump administration, or a few months, some of them, and had to get out screaming. But there were people who were there for quite some time, who were good, loyal servants. And some of them started off carrying bags, and by the end of the administration got quite fancy jobs.
Yeah. I'll tell you what concerns me about these guys with you were talking about the Trump side. The thing that worries me more about them is what I associate with the Claremont Institute, if you haven't already gotten this, is their talk of crisis, of the coming civil war. I've read a number of pieces from Claremont at the Institute about that. But they wrote one of their scholars, in inverted commas, wrote the most famous pro-Trump piece in the 2016 election, suggesting it was the election was like being aboard one of the planes in September 11, about to crash into a building, and Trump is the passengers storming the cockpit and taking control of the controls. And yes, you might die, but it's the only way to save the plane or save the nation at that point in time. They very much have that kind of emergency kind of rhetoric. And I tell you what bothers me about that. There's a piece I'll put in the homework as well. A lot of the homework this week. If you just go down to the blurb underneath the videos, either Facebook or YouTube, you'll see a whole bunch of links. There's an article I read written, this is a few months back, but I made note about it. And now it's relevant, from an Irish person who lived through the 70s and wrote about the problems they had in Northern Ireland. And he wrote about why Civil War talk is never good. I'm going to read a quote for you. The belief that there was going to be a civil war in Ireland made everything worse. Once that idea takes hold, it has a force of its own. The demagogues warn that the other side is mobilizing. They're coming for us. Not only do we have to defend ourselves, but we have to deny them the advantage of making the first move. The logic of the preemptive strike sets in. Do it to them before they do it to you. The other side, of course, is thinking the same thing. That year, 1972, was one of the most murderous in Northern Ireland, precisely because this doomsday mentality was shared by ordinary, rational people like my father. Premonitions of civil war serve not as portents to be heeded, but as a warrant for carnage. And I thought that, like, that's why these guys worry me, because they push us a bit too far down that direction for my liking.
Yeah. The other article or book that's published and been talked about a lot that I've been referring to is The Bronze Age Mindset, apparently written by this Yale-educated theorist who goes by the name of the Bronze Age Pervert.
I might point out in the reading list, Dr. Brendon.
Yeah, which is in the New York Times article about the Claremont Review, which talks about the sort of degraded elite, the reduced power of men, and the sort of innate kind of highest species in our community. And so, yeah, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This is the stuff of the most kind of bizarre video game, but it's, this is sort of circulating around, I suppose, the alt-right as a kind of thesis about civilizations. And I suppose civilization talk is very much that kind of cloud, or that was used for race. That this was a way of talking about race in this kind of pseudo-intellectual manner. And there was quite a lot of it in the 1950s in the United States, and it was largely clamped out, by academics and intellectuals, people like Richard Hofstadter, Hans Morgenthau, these towering intellectuals. They kind of crushed this stuff, although there was a lot of it in the popular culture, the John Birch Society, McCarthyism, all of that. Intellectually, a lot of this stuff was really marginalized and gatekept. The challenge with the internet is, it's very hard to gatekeep things. Yeah. And this stuff flourishes. Maybe it was just kept in the cellar. Maybe it was a demon that was in the cellar always wanting to get out, and it hadn't been analyzed enough and thought about it. It had just been ignored or pushed away. And the internet allows for that, the flourishing of all of the sort of strange thoughts that people have ever had, and very hard to gatekeep.
That should be a t-shirt for this podcast. The strange thoughts that everyone had, which is very difficult to gatekeep. I better reset the Zoom, and when we come back, let's talk about the big story of the week, the immigration. I don't know what to call it, farce. Martha's Vineyard. We'll talk about that right after the white flash. Okay, let's get into the topical stuff. But just before we do. One thing that no one's talking about with this issue is the actual issue of illegal immigration, which I've been wanting to talk about for weeks because I'm into this, and it's important. It really gets ignored, and I've actually got a real bee in my bonnet about the fact that people are going crazy about 50 migrants in a holiday destination in Martha's Vineyard when this is so much bigger as an issue, and it just gets ignored. So let me just spend 5 to 10 minutes setting up the story so far. And then, Dr. Brendon, I'll let you loose on the events of the week. All right. And jump in anytime if you want to add anything on the background of illegal immigration, please. Just for the record, the stats I'm about to tell you are fiscal year stats. The fiscal year starts in October. Okay. So these immigration figures are up to July. So that's 10 out of 12 months of the current fiscal year. Okay. In July, there were 200,000 encounters with illegal immigrants on the southern border. There were 1.95 million encounters just for the first 10 months of the current fiscal year. That's already an all-time record, and there are 2 months left. Before last year, the record was 1.6 million. So we're going way past previous records at the moment. That's a huge number. In terms of population, it's like Australia getting 140,000 boat people a year. We went crazy for 5,000 boat people back in 2001. These are massive numbers of people, okay? Our entire country would just freak the hell out if this happened to us. But that's what's going on in America right now. And that, by the way, is not counting the people who get past the border guards, because 500,000 people have gotten past the border security this year as well, on top of that 2 million so far in the first 10 months of the fiscal year. So who are these people? Well, it's actually changing, and it's changed in the last year quite a lot since I last talked about this. 134,000 of the 200,000 people in July were single adults. They used to be mostly families, and that's partly because where they have come from has changed. They originally came from Mexico way back 20, 30 years ago. Then they came from, in the last 10, 15 years, they came from Central America, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, those kinds of countries. Those numbers have not dropped off much. But now they're much, much more from the rest of the world. There's actually more from the rest of the world than either from Mexico or from Central America. That's the majority, not the majority, the plurality is now from the rest of the world. That's about 40% of the migrants in July this year. So it's about 80,000 per month, growing rapidly. The biggest new countries are Colombia, Venezuela, and Cuba. 17,600 Venezuelans came in July, which was up from 6,000 the July before. 175,000 Cubans have come this fiscal year, so that's about 17,000 per month. There are 120,000 in total for the Mariel boat lift back in 1980, which was this huge event of all these Cubans coming over to Florida. People going like there's this mass migration that went for months and months, if not years. There are many more than that have just come this year alone from Cuba, ignoring all the rest of the people. And that's partly because Nicaragua now allows Cubans to fly there without visas, so it makes it easier for them to come. But since they're coming from further countries, Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, those kinds of countries, the journey is much longer. These are new countries they haven't been coming from before. So when this first starts from a new country, taking an arduous journey, it tends to be single adults. And then when it works out, then they bring their families along. So you can expect, if this works out like it previously did with Mexicans and Central Americans, you can expect in the coming years for there to be many more family members and for there to be many more numbers, full stop. So what happens to them when they arrive? That's who's here. What happens when they arrive?
So on the who comes,
jump in. Yeah.
There are also people from the European continent, the Middle East, coming. I mean, maybe you can explain that to us. What these clearly are not people who've just come, from the Caribbean islands, but even further afield in terms of flying into Mexico or Central America, and then coming through that process, people from some of the sort of parts of the Middle East which have had problems, maybe some Africans coming that way, isn't there? From some stuff I've been reading. There
have been people from 160 different countries this year. So they come from everywhere. But yes, there are definitely some Africans and definitely some Europeans and some Asians. I mean, look, this is just my speculation, because with when the numbers aren't massive, it's hard to see the trend. But my guess is that it's a combination of Trump really cracking down on immigration. I don't mean illegal immigration, I mean legal immigration when he was there, and really cracking down on refugees, basically zeroing out the refugee program entirely when he was there. And COVID obviously just stopped all forms of immigration. To a period where they feel that the Biden administration is a soft touch on this kind of stuff. So they're trying to take advantage of the time when they can get through before it gets tough again. That's my guess. But I don't know. I don't have evidence either way on that. That's just my suspicion. I guess we're going to need a few years to see what happens with the trends with the people from those places, in particular Africa. I do think that's related to the refugee intake being zero, because it has been zero for the last 3 years of the Trump administration. Okay, so what happens to them when they arrive? Well, unlike what conservatives say, it's not an open border. Like conservatives go, oh, open borders, anyone can just walk over. That is not true. And it's actually a stupid thing to say, because a lot of people die coming over the border, trying to sneak over. Just a couple of weeks ago, 53 people were cooked alive in a packing container, trying to get smuggled across in the desert in the middle of the summer. There have been 650 migrants who died trying to cross the border last year, 650. And it's probably going to be more this year when the final 2 months are counted up. They wouldn't be risking their lives if they could just stroll over the border. The border is not open. Okay. A huge number of them immediately bounced back to Mexico under what's called Title 42. Title 42 is a COVID measure that automatically rejects anyone who could possibly be carrying COVID. Now, Biden tried to get rid of that. That was something under Trump, obviously, as a COVID measure. Biden tried to get rid of it a couple of months ago, saying the pandemic's over. The court didn't accept that because of the process they went through. So Title 42 still exists even now. I suspect he's actually secretly thankful because it helps trim the numbers because there's such a large number of people coming through at the moment. Courts won't let America deport kids under Title 42. So if you're a kid and you come over, you stay. If Mexico will not accept people being bounced who aren't from Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So if you're from any of those countries, you just get, and you're an adult, you get automatically bounced. Automatically. Don't want open borders. But remember what I just said, the plurality of the new immigrants are from other countries that Mexico will not accept. So those people end up staying. Not all of them. There are exceptions. They do run some deportation flights back to Brazil, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Haiti. But there are way too many migrants to arrange flights for all of them. It's just too many people. They're just swamped by the numbers. It took 3 months to send 10,000 migrants back to Haiti when they were going crazy with flights, constant flights. But there's just too many. And America just can't send people back to Nicaragua, Venezuela, or Cuba, which happen to be the 3 major new countries, because their governments don't have constructive relationships with America. So those people aren't flying back. Mexico's not taking them. There's nowhere to put them. If Trump was president, it would be exactly the same. There is nowhere to put them, so they have to stay. Biden's been trying to lean on Mexico to take these people. So far, Mexico's refusing. So that's where we're at so far. Title 42 is obviously becoming less effective over time because of that reason, as more people come from other countries. There have been 2 million expulsions under Title 42, and mostly under Biden. In July, it was 74,000 out of 200,000 of those encounters were Title 42 expulsions, immediately bounced back. Note, those numbers I just said are encounters or expulsions, not people. Because the same people keep coming back. Every time they get bounced, they just come back again. So the same people are being bounced many, many times. So that is something to bear in mind. Also note, Title 42 doesn't care if you're a legitimate asylum seeker. If you're a single adult from the wrong country, you're gone. It doesn't matter if you're an asylum seeker. So what that means is political refugees would be getting rejected under Title 42 if they came from the wrong country. And economic migrants would be accepted, even though they're not meant to be, if they're from the right country with Title 42. That's the situation. So it's a kind of an arbitrary kind of situation, not really just at all. They're not filtering out the political refugees from the economic migrants. They're just, some countries they stay, some countries they go. What they're not doing anymore is remain in Mexico. That was a Trump administration plan. It was the American equivalent of offshore processing in Australia, except for it was in Mexico. I actually think it would have been a good idea if they tried to do that properly, where they had, if they gave these people real processing really fast, in an efficient manner, in a humane manner, it would have been worth trying, but they didn't. And what happened with Trump was they said, we're going to process you. And then they didn't process them. They just left them there for 2 years doing nothing in shanty towns, which was incredibly inhumane and awful. I still think they should do it properly, but the whole idea has been poisoned because of how Trump screwed it up. So that's not going to happen anytime soon. Okay, what happens to everyone else? The people who actually get in there. Okay, well, they get processed. If they have some kind of family connection or sponsors in America, they get sent to stay with the sponsors and the family while they're going through their case to see if they have a legitimate claim for political asylum. While they wait for their court date, they can work, but it takes 12 months to get a work visa. So for 12 months, they have no means of supporting themselves at all. So of course, they're going to be a drain on someone, right, for that reason. The current crop are expected to wait for 7 years before their case is processed. That's how backlogged the system is. 7 years is how long it will take to decide whether they are actually legitimate asylum seekers or whether they should go home. So obviously that's incredibly dysfunctional. Those that have nowhere to go, that don't have sponsors, they're supposed to be in government accommodation, but there's too many of them. There's just not enough spaces in government accommodation, even though they've built heaps of government accommodation in the last few years. And so what happens is they just get put on a bus to wherever, you're on your own, or they just stay in the streets. El Paso, which is a hub for a lot of these people, constantly just turns out 1,000 people at a time. They did so just this week. Another 1,000 people turned out on the streets with nothing, and they just sleep in tents underneath on the sidewalk or underneath the overpass or something like that. They get these big shanty towns of immigrants. That's not sustainable or positive in any way, shape, or form. It's not just border towns struggling with numbers. A lot of them go to Atlanta. Atlanta is really struggling as well. It's spreading around America slowly. There's more and more people. The problem is there's just so many of them, right? And then they're the people who are trying to do the right thing. I've just talked about, by the way. All these people aren't dodgy. They're going through the court system and they're trying to do what they're meant to do. They're turning up to ICE, but there's still just too many of them. Then there's the people who aren't trying to do the right thing. They're the undesirables. In the first 9 months of this fiscal year, there have been 66 migrants apprehended who are on the terrorism screening database. That doesn't mean they're terrorists, but it just tells you how easy it would be, and who knows about the gotaways, how easy it would be for the wrong person to get through in this kind of system. That's, by the way, twice the number of people in the previous 5 years combined. That's 66. There's also the issue of fentanyl coming across the southern border as well. This is not the only way fentanyl comes to America, but more people are dying of fentanyl overdose in America this year than ever before. There were 70,000 in 2021. So conservatives are trying to make a thing out of the fentanyl thing at the moment. They're talking about rainbow fentanyl a lot, which is just fentanyl, but multicolored. I don't know, toddlers are supposed to go for it. No, they're not saying that, but it seems ridiculous. They're obsessed about the color for whatever reason. Kevin McCarthy last week literally said that people can overdose just by merely touching rainbow fentanyl. That's bullshit. It's just normal fentanyl. JD Vance suggests that Biden might be trying to intentionally kill Trump voters by allowing rainbow fentanyl to cross the borders.
If you wanted to kill a bunch of MAGA voters in the middle of the heartland, how better than to target them and their kids with this deadly fentanyl? And man, it does look intentional. It's like Joe Biden wants to punish the people who didn't vote for him, and opening up the floodgates to the border is one way to do it.
This is garbage. Fentanyl seizures by weight have been pretty consistent since Trump's last 6 months. They've basically been staying the same. There was a big spike in July. That's the first month, so maybe this will change. But so far, fentanyl is pretty much steady over the border. And carfentanil is the real issue anyway. That's 100 times more potent than fentanyl anyway. So let's leave that aside. Bottom line, difference between Biden and Trump is that remain in Mexico. That's one difference. Mexico was going to let that happen under Trump for much longer anyway. They were getting sick of it. The main difference is got nothing to do with the border at all, actually. The main difference between Biden and Trump is arrests and deportations in America. People who have overstayed their visas or who have lost their asylum cases or not turned up to court, their arrests dropped from 140,000 a year under Trump to 70,000 under Biden, and deportations dropped from about 200,000 per year to 60,000 under Biden. Really just a drop in the ocean with the tens of millions of migrants that are in America. But that is the major difference between the two. And of course, the way they speak publicly about immigration, that's very different. And that's what I think people notice the most, the way they talk about it. In a way, Biden's kind of got the worst of both worlds because the processing system is terrible, unfair, arbitrary, and utterly dysfunctional, just like it's been for a long time. It should deter people from coming over. But the Biden administration is so afraid of talking tough, that in itself encourages more people to come. Just this week, I read one migrant saying, quote, I decide to come here to take advantage of the situation where you can come in. It's not easy, but the border could become more closed in the future. I believe before it was more complicated when it comes to being undocumented in this country. So they think they can get through, and they do, but then it's horrific. So that's the worst of all worlds for me. The strange thing about this is, even despite all this, the American people aren't really being poisoned towards immigrants. If you look at Pew polling recently, 73% so they want to increase security along the border to reduce illegal crossings. They said that should be a very or somewhat important goal of US immigration policy, including 59% of Democrats. And 57% wanted to increase deportations of those here illegally, including 39% Democrats. But 73% still want to take in refugees escaping violence and war, including 58% Republicans. So they still were pro-refugee. And 60% still want to organize a way for those illegally here to stay here legally, including 40% Republicans. So they haven't been totally poisoned to migrants as yet, but let's see what happens over the next few years. That pretty much takes us to the current the current situation, which is...
Yeah, but I mean, out of that, what is your preferred way forward? I mean, what would be the sane, humane way here? Okay. Would it be you employ a lot of people to be involved in processing, so that processing, as you say, gets done quickly and humanely, but if they're, given the best information you can find, there's going to be a lot of people who are not going to get through that processing, who can't be simply put back into Mexico. Does the United States need to have a whole range of new government airplanes that fly these people back to apparently where they've seemed to have come from? I mean, what is a practical approach to this? I mean, it's not likely to happen, but what would be a much better alternative?
Okay, well, I would say there's two issues here. Number one, what you do with people who are already in America, and what you do to people who are trying to get into America. The first one is the easiest, I think, which is that you need to have a sponsorship program. Okay, great, because Americans are willing to sponsor people. They are actually, they had one for Ukraine quite recently, where 120,000 people volunteered to sponsor Ukrainian refugees. They only had 50,000 applying, but they had 120,000 volunteering. So for places like Cuba and Venezuela, places where there's a dictator there, I bet you could get enough Americans to sponsor the number of migrants they have coming over. And when I say sponsor, I mean to give them a place to stay and to the place until they're allowed to work, which should be sooner than 12 months, by the way, and also making sure that they go to their court dates, letting them know this is what you need, because these people often don't speak English, and so you need to communicate to them what they are required to do to qualify to apply for asylum. So that they help them out in that regard as well. So that's the first thing I think would help. That wouldn't solve everything, but I think that would help if you had more sponsorship programs. That's the first thing. The second, which the government would probably subsidize, I assume. Number two, and for stopping people getting in, like I said, I thought the Remain in Mexico in principle would have actually worked quite well if they did it properly. If they just rained immigration judges on the processing centers, kept them there for only a month or two, given proper resources so they're not being murdered and beaten up like these people were in these shanty towns, actually looking after them, make it a very quick process. If they're rejected, they're not getting into America. So you don't have to deport them because they're not getting in the first place. And if you do that, then people who aren't political asylum seekers will be less likely to come. That's what I think. I mean, because look, I'm very pro-immigration. I'm super pro-immigration, and I have no problems with economic migrants. But I do think you do need to have control over the number of people who are coming into your country. If there is going to be a situation soon where there's maybe 3 million a year coming through, and that is unmanageable from a resource point of view. And so you just need to trim the numbers a little bit. The other thing which I think they need to do, and they always say this, but they never do, is they need to process them in the countries they're coming from. If you know that Nicaragua or Honduras or whatever is going to have a lot of migrants, you need to offer them the opportunity to apply for asylum there. And you need to have many more immigration spots, legal immigration spots. That was something that Trump did that was awful. He reduced the number of legal immigration spots available to these people, so they had no other options but to try and come over illegally. So if you offer many more legal immigration spots to the people, to the areas you know want to come, and you offer them the opportunity to process them for political asylum, to be a refugee, I think you'd be much less likely for people to take the incredible risk of traveling all that way to come over. That's what I think. I'm not saying it would solve everything. This is a very difficult problem, but I'm saying it would do a hell of a lot better than the last two administrations have done. That is what I'm saying. That's my take. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, as you say, huge problem, and with global warming likely to be a bigger problem.
Yeah.
I mean, some people who are back to this, the end of liberal democracy argument that we were talking about in the first part of the podcast, think that one of the big reasons to sort of really address global warming is to stop, this sort of avalanche of climate refugees spreading across the sort of more wealthy nations like the United States, and that this will fundamentally undermine democracy, that it will lead to more of this sort of white nationalism, authoritarianism, and, this will just be terrible for democracy. This is a recent book by Anatol Lleven on climate change and democracy, which makes his point very strongly.
What's it called? I'll put on the reading list.
Only nations can solve climate change. I'll get the exact title. Anatol Lleven's recent book. Smart guy, and has been an expert on nationalism for a long time.
Yeah.
And his recent book doesn't have a sexy title, but it's a good read, is Climate Change and the Nation State.
Great.
And it's basically an argument to saying the future of the nation state is requiring climate change to be really forcefully addressed, and government states are going to be the big actors, not the UN, not international agreements. It's actually the big nations of the world have to step forward. So it's actually an argument in favor of nationalism. That's not something academics usually make, but an argument in favor of nationalism to solve climate change, to say nationalism's got to be animated, liberal nationalism which wants to act, because otherwise we've got a authoritarian nationalism which will be very anti-immigrant if this isn't addressed, because this issue, the volume that you're talking about is significant. The systems are overwhelmed. There's no effort to keep up in some regards with the amount of processing people judges needed. And this also speaks to a certain kind of decline of the American state, that if the apparatuses of the state can't cope with a whole bunch of problems that you have, it's hard to have much faith in it. Yeah. So it really has to step up. And I don't know. I mean, what are the reasons why an Obama or a Biden administration, they are the administrative state, they are sort of in charge of these big departments. Why cannot they get the budget to really raise at least the processing capacities of these departments?
Look, they've been trying. They have certainly put on more immigration judges. There is no doubt about that. But I think it's just a gargantuan task. It's you just always need more money. It's a tough one. Yeah.
Yeah. So stunts.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk stunts. Okay. All right. So the background of the stunt, and then I'm going to let you go on the current stunt, is that for the last few months, Greg Abbott, the Texas governor, and the Arizona governor, Doug Ducey, have been sending migrants to blue states, sanctuary states. They haven't been. They've been seeing bus after bus after bus. Basically, the numbers vary from article to article. I'm going to take the biggest numbers just because why not? They've sent 9,500 migrants to Washington, D.C., a little under 2,000 in New York, and they've just started sending them to Chicago, about 100 migrants to Chicago so far. It appears like no one goes on these buses unless they want to go. All right, I'm talking about the ones up to now, up to the last week, right? They seem to be treated well. There's no suggestion of mistreatment. The places get about 24 hours notice before the new buses arrive. right? And the blue states are reacting exactly as Greg Abbott wants them to react, which is they're freaking out. They're calling him heartless, and they give him heaps of free publicity, which he loves because he's running for governor, and he's in this cold primary with Ron DeSantis at the moment for 2024 as well. So he loves the attention. They're talking about an emergency, etc. Like the Washington DC has been trying to get in the National Guard to help them and all this kind of stuff, and they're calling it a humanitarian crisis. And of course they point out, well, look at Texas, look at the towns in Texas. What they're dealing with is a lot like it's a lot like there's a town, Eagle Pass, has a population of 30,000 that gets 10,000 migrants every single week, compared to the 10,000 in Washington DC over the last 5 months, which has a population of 700,000, etc. And most amusingly, the Chicago mayor bussed their 100 migrants immediately to another place and without telling them, just doing the same thing as someone else, and they're going, oh, look, the hypocrites. Anyway, my point is, I actually have a certain amount of sympathy for those moves, in that the blue states have been doing a lot of sanctimony about the illegal immigration situation and going, oh, sanctuary states, all this kind of stuff, and they've paid no price for that. Texas is the one, and Arizona are the ones who are doing all the heavy lifting at the moment. And I understand why Greg Abbott's trying to get their attention, to say, maybe we should all row in the same direction here, and maybe you should help us out if you believe so strongly in this. I kind of have sympathy for that point of view. But everything changed a week ago because the stunts went into hyperdrive and they became really stupid. And in my view, they lost me completely. Would you like to start talking to the new stunts, Brendon?
Well, I suppose people are close followers of Ron DeSantis and his rise to the presidency one day, potentially, sending people from Texas. So getting people as part of this Texas move that you say, promising them what on some reports almost sounds like a holiday, but at least something, a job, being ahead of them in Texas, getting them on a flight that's paid for by the citizens of Florida, and flying them to this salubrious part of the United States that probably some of us only know about from the holidaying of the Clinton family, Martha's Vineyard, off the coast of Massachusetts, a sort of place for New England kind of royalty from a long way back. I was kind of curious about where does this name actually come from? Yes. Martha's Vineyard. And I did a bit of research, and the first thing I came across was apparently there's a lot of Reddit discussions about whether it was named after Martha Stewart. And some of you might not know who Martha Stewart was, but she was one of the sort of great American tally chefs in that sort of Rick Stein British tradition. And she had a huge following and was on daytime television all the time, a major celebrity in America, kind of like Ellen, or even, getting up to Oprah standards. And she got sent to jail for insider trading. And Martha's Vineyard isn't named after Martha Stewart. It's actually named after a niece of some early aristocrat who came over to the United States. But the other Martha that I was, some of you might have followed over the last year, was that series on Martha Mitchell, the Gaslit series that was a Slate podcast and then played by Julia Roberts. Certainly not named after her, but it would be a great tribute to Martha Mitchell if you thought that. And this was this stunt that DeSantis pulled off, sending these people to Martha's Vineyard, had echoes. I was doing a bit of reading for this of 1962 efforts by people who did not believe in desegregation in the American South. One of the sort of great moves of the American sort of civil rights movement or support, often quite a lot of young college students, a lot of white college students, was to go on these freedom rides. Australia eventually has them sort of mirroring the United States as well, where people bus into the southern states, sit on buses with African Americans and white Americans integrating, showing that there shouldn't be a segregation of buses, of schools, of fountains, drinking fountains, of lunch counters. And so that was a way of trying to break down the segregation of the South by associating with African Americans, trying to challenge these kind of color lines that there were in the South. In a 1962 move, some staunch segregationists thought, okay, we'll have what we call the reverse freedom rides, and we're going to get some African Americans and we're going to bus them to the place of the president at the time, John F. Kennedy's holiday spot, Hyannis Port, which I've actually visited on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. One of these, another one of these fancy places, not as fancy as I don't think Martha's Vineyard, but if you've followed American presidents, you often see them going to these retreats for the summer holidays. The name that I'm always sort of struggling on is the Bush family with their Kennebunkport holiday home in Maine. These are sort of often really palatial places with enormous front lawns and tennis courts, and so Hyannis Port for the Kennedy clan, that was their place. These people arrived, and it was so this DeSantis' stunt in some ways follows that tradition of sending those African Americans there. The last point I'll make on those grand American holiday homes is I had COVID a couple of months back, and I read a great memoir by a New Yorker writer, a guy called Tad Friend, one of those great American names, and he writes this great memoir, but largely about his family and his father, called In the Early Years, and I'd highly recommend it. And I was incredibly jealous in many ways, a class resentment of these, places that you can go for your summer holidays and put your feet up and hear the sea and sit out on your lawn having picnics. When my family holidayed in a small part of New Zealand called Mahia Peninsula, we went to what New Zealanders call a batch, or South Australians call a shack, a sort of fibro kind of place where there's a few bunks. And at the time as a kid, I thought that was paradise. But now that I'm familiar with presidential history, I realized that would be sort of a boat shed. One of these places that there's nothing fancy about, nothing grand about it at all.
Look, a boat shed is paradise if you're a barnacle, I guess.
Yeah, well, you're close to the sea. But yeah, I mean, this is an incredibly serious issue of like, how is this going to be played out? I mean, what's the next move?
Yeah.
I mean, what is the next move, Chad?
I'll tell you the next move, because it's already happened. What happened the day after DeSantis's Martha Vineyard stunt was Greg Abbott dropped all pretense of making a legitimate point and just went to full troll mode, which DeSantis had elevated to. And he sent 2 busloads just directly to Kamala Harris's house in Washington, D.C. Not just in Washington, D.C. generally, but straight to her official residence, where she presumably wasn't at the time. And he sent 2 more busloads 2 days after that. So that's the next step, sending them to people's actual homes, which also, by the way, is reminiscent of the reverse freedom rides that you referred to, because I was sending them to Kennedy's home back then as well. And by the way, I might also add, this is not just similar. This is similar to reverse freedom rides in a lot of ways, because let me just read you some quotes. This is from an article written in 2019. Okay, so this is well before this happened. This is from NPR writing about the reverse freedom rides. The idea was simple. When large numbers of African Americans showed up on northern doorsteps, Northerners would not be able to accommodate them. They would not want them, and their hypocrisy would be exposed, which is exactly the logic we are seeing right now being employed by DeSantis and co. Then a quote from one of the organizers: for many years, certain politicians, educators, and certain religious leaders have used the white people of the South as a whipping boy, to put it mildly, to further their own ends in their political campaigns. We're going to find out if people like Ted Kennedy and the Kennedys, all of them, really do have an interest in the Negro people, really do have a love for the Negro. Now, if you replace the word Negro with migrant there, you can see we could have heard that quote in the last 2 days, right? Talking about the Martha's Vineyard people. And a congressman from the time, from Mississippi as well, quote, they want to free the Negro in the South, but want to shun responsibility for him once he's been freed. Once again, exactly the logic we're hearing right now. So I think the parallels are very strong between this and the reverse freedom rides. I should also say, by the way, because we glossed over this, there are some very key differences between the Martha's Vineyard drop off and what Greg Abbott was doing before. This time they gave no notice whatsoever. Greg Abbott was giving them 24 hours notice that migrants were coming. This time they made a point of giving them zero notice. They rang the press. They had a videographer going with them, but they didn't. So when the migrants arrived, there was a zoo of cameras, but they didn't tell anyone actually at Martha's Vineyard that they were coming, so they couldn't prepare, which of course makes an absurd test because that's just really, so that's a key difference, I should say. I should also say another parallel is they tricked the reverse freedom rider black people to get on those buses. They told them there'd be lots of jobs waiting and everyone was going to look after them and stuff. And then they didn't tell the people they were coming and drop them off. So the trickery is also a parallel, which we'll get to in a second. Right after this white flash. Okay, I've got a few things to say about this. This has got me quite hot under the collar, actually, because I do care a lot about the issue of immigration. So I don't like trolling as an immigration strategy. All right, okay. The first point I'd like to make is that DeSantis should get his own idea, because Trump suggested this back in 2019, number one. Ted Cruz introduced a bill last year that would do this. Tucker Carlson suggested they do this exact stunt back in July. This lame idea has been floating around like an unflushable turd in conservative world for the last few years. And DeSantis is now taking laps of honor like he's the conservative Edison. It's quite sad, but also it's really annoying Trump, which is quite funny because Trump is not happy that DeSantis is getting credit for this. That was the idea he said first, which might start their war early. So this could backfire on DeSantis. He doesn't want to start Trump too early going against him. But anyway, I'll just say that, firstly. Secondly, is DeSantis making a fair point? Like the point of saying, oh, they're all hypocrites over at Martha's Vineyard because they're only there for 24 hours and then they sent them off to the military. They sent them off to a military facility. Okay, well, I'll say this. He's right about the media, who basically ignored illegal immigration for 2 years. I do agree where there's infinite outrage to go there, was there should be. And yet they came out in force of 50 people dropped off in a rich vacation spot. He's right about that. But about the Martha's Vineyard people, very, very unfair. There are two kinds of reactions I've seen. Number one, people saying, I thought they loved migrants. They should be so happy. The migrants are here now. Right? And two, this is a quote from a typical conservative reaction on Twitter. Martha's Vineyard set a beautiful example for the nation. They used the military to deport every last illegal immigrant from their island in less than 48 hours. The entire nation should emulate Martha's Vineyard. Okay, point one is asinine. The one about they love migrants, I thought. Or because you support something doesn't mean you want unlimited amounts of it when you're not expecting it. I mean, do you like Americans? Sure. Well, you should love it if we drop 500 of them in your living room. Oh, yeah, I thought you loved Americans. It's a ridiculous piece of logic. Does Tucker Carlson support the Second Amendment? So he should be thrilled if we get 50 dudes with guns to surround his daughter. That should make them all feel very safe. I mean, it's just such juvenile logic, right? It's the logic of a schoolyard bully. It's trolling, right? If you wanted a fair test, if you actually wanted a fair test, what you would have done is, number one, you would have picked a location which is a sanctuary city. I know that Martha's Vineyard, there's like a poster somewhere that says, all are welcome here, hate has no business here, and we stand with immigrants. But that's pretty weak tea to try and make them the centerpiece of an experiment. What he's doing is trying to upset his cultural enemies. That's what he's doing. He's not making any point about immigration at all. Like he's just exploiting immigrants to do yet another culture war hit. That's what he's doing, right? If you wanted a real test and you picked the right location, you would tell them that you're sending those migrants over and then see what they do. That's what you would do. That's what happens in Texas. Those border towns in Texas, they know that there's people coming, so they prepare. By the way, the feds help them as well. They don't just do it by themselves. But no, he told the videographers to go, he told the media to go, but he didn't tell Martha's Vineyard. So that's a false test. He couldn't risk Martha's Vineyard actually dealing with it well, so he rigged the test so there's no way they could know about it, right? As for two, they deported them after 48 hours. No, they didn't. They just sent them to where people could process them properly with the correct resources. Those migrants hadn't fully gone through the process yet. They had to finish being processed before they were even eligible to be in Martha's Vineyard. They weren't allowed to be there until they'd gone through the process. Supporting them being treated appropriately by the government is a legitimate path to take. That is sensible. And conservatives know that. The whole thing reeks of trolling. Okay, so let me talk about the DeSantis hypocrisy for a second. You can jump in anytime you want, by the way, Brendon. I'm just rushing because we've been doing this podcast forever. The flights, massively hypocritical, because you mentioned that they came from Texas. They came from San Antonio. They flew them to Florida and then to Martha's Vineyard. Why did they do that? Because there's a law in Florida that the $12 million in funding is that they're spending on this is only supposed to be for deporting people from Florida. So they imported migrants so then they could deport them to follow the letter of the law, which is just ridiculous. But the hypocrisy is extreme because these migrants, they're Venezuelans, right? These guys are all Venezuelans. It just so happens that DeSantis has a lot to say about Venezuela. It just so happens. DeSantis says, quote, Maduro is responsible for countless atrocities and has driven Venezuela into the ground. We do not accept Joe Biden legitimizing a murderous tyrant, and we stand with the people in South Florida and the people in Venezuela who are seeking freedom. So he stands with the people in Venezuela. That's exactly the test that they ran on Martha's Vineyard, having some shitty poster up somewhere on the internet. He stood with the people of Venezuela, yet he's deporting them over to Martha's Vineyard. That is just rank hypocrisy, right? Also, we'll come back to them in a second. More hypocrisy. In June, Ron DeSantis had a big old whinge about the federal government flying immigrants around on ghost flights. And they had 70 flights to Florida, where in the middle of the night, they'd drop off a bunch of illegal immigrants. And he went crazy. But there's some key differences there. The government was dropping them off to places where they had accommodation, to places that were ready for them, that were run by the federal government usually, but even if they weren't, even if they were private organizations, they were taking these people on willingly, right? But let me quote DeSantis in June, quote, there's no warning. It's just in the middle of the night. And then you wake up and someone will say, they brought a bunch of unaccompanied minors. So DeSantis did exactly the same thing, except for he gave them no warning and didn't organize at all. So it was much worse. So there's rank hypocrisy there. Let's get back to the Venezuelans for a second. You might be asking yourself, why didn't he get those refugees from the asylum seekers from Florida? Why didn't he get these illegal immigrants from Florida? Florida has heaps of illegal immigrants. You're right. They do have heaps of illegal immigrants, but they're special illegal immigrants in Florida. They're Cubans. And Cubans occupy a very, very special role in Florida society, especially for Republicans, right? Let me give you an example. Back in, I think it was August, Deputy Governor Jeanette Nunes said that DeSantis had, quote, secured funding to make sure that people that are coming illegally, they don't stay here with their arms crossed, thinking about what they'll be able to do. We're going to send that person, frankly, to Delaware, the president's home state. She never even said the nationality. She just said illegal immigrants, but that blew up in her face. And the very powerful Cuban lobby got all offended. They got their knickers in a twist. So then she said it was a general discussion about illegal immigration, not targeted at Cuban migrants that are fleeing a dictatorial regime. I think I know that best, the daughter of Cuban immigrants. And then she put out a statement. Entering the country illegally and fleeing the dictatorship to seek asylum are two different things. And misrepresenting that is offensive. These people were from Venezuela, which is also a dictatorship. So obviously they were too scared to offend the Cuban lobby in Florida. So they got some Venezuelans instead, even though they were doing the very thing that Jeanette Nunes said they were trying, that they need to distinguish from an economic migrant. So I agree with her. Misrepresenting that they are entering the country illegally is offensive, but that's what they did, the DeSantis people. So that's pretty hypocritical. By the way, also, I should say, DeSantis said the reason they got them from Texas, because he didn't admit the Cuban thing, of course. He said the reason they got them from Texas was because, quote, 40% of them say they want to go to Florida, which leaves 60% by my count who don't. So yeah, anyway, so there's that as well. Were they deceived? The trickery. Was this exactly like the reverse freedom rides with the trickery? Well, bit complicated. There were early claims by some outlets that the migrants were told they were going to Boston, but DeSantis denied it, and I believe him. I believe him because when the immigration lawyer who represented them showed what they were given a map showing Martha's Vineyard marked on a map of America. So clearly they were told they'll go to Martha's Vineyard. Okay, so I don't think they were misled in that respect. But that's just one claim, because that wasn't the only thing they were given. They were also given a brochure that said, and this is more detailed to what you said before, Dr. Brendon. The brochure said, let me quote, that in Massachusetts, they'd be eligible for numerous benefits, including 8 months cash assistance, assistance with housing, food, clothing, transportation to job interviews, job training, job placement, registering children for school, assistance, applying for social security cards, as well as many other benefits. I've seen the brochure, okay? There's proof. They were given that brochure. None of that was true. Those benefits are only available to refugees who have been, quote, referred by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and authorized to live in the United States. That's the law. At this stage, none of them qualified for that. In fact, if they followed the process they were told to follow, it pretty much guaranteed that none of them would ever be eligible for those benefits. So that is fraud right there, committed by someone. I don't know who, whether it's at the top level, or whether it's at the contractor level. Someone committed fraud. They broke the law. Someone. Also, note that if it's true that they were misled, which I think it is, then that, while this is not people smuggling, that is what people smugglers do. They often lie to people to get them to make a journey they wouldn't otherwise make. But this is not people smuggling because they weren't mistreated. Martha's Vineyard treated them well. I think people calling Ron DeSantis a people smuggler, that's too much. But I do think fraud was committed at the very least. But the most disturbing bit, which has got not nearly enough attention, this to me is the thing that makes me the angriest, was something that was a claim made by their immigration attorney, Rachel Self, which I happen to believe. I'm going to play you this claim, Dr. Brendon.
Before they boarded the planes, the migrants were processed by agents of the Department of Homeland Security, who listed falsified addresses on the migrants' paperwork. Agents apparently chose random homeless shelters all across the country, from Washington to Florida, to list the migrants' mailing addresses, even when told by the migrants that they had no address in the U.S. According to the paperwork provided to them, the migrants are required to check in with ICE office nearest to the fake address chosen for them by DHS or be permanently removed from the United States, with some required to check in as early as this coming Monday. It could not be clearer that this is an attempt to ensure that these people are ordered removed, even as they try as hard as they can to comply with the instructions provided to them. There is no other reason to list as someone's mailing address a homeless shelter in Tacoma, Washington, when they ship him to Massachusetts.
For those who didn't follow that, they were told, they were given addresses in places on the other side of America that had nothing to do with them, where they had to report some people as early as Monday while being sent to Massachusetts. If they didn't do that, they would not qualify for political asylum. There were possibly legitimate asylum seekers who were going to get deported eventually, somewhere down the track, because of this ruse. People who should have qualified, who these people screwed over in a way that they wouldn't have qualified. That is awful. And I might add, that was DHS agents. They were federal agents. So I don't know who that was, but whoever that is needs to get fired and potentially charged, because that is really bad. So that is the thing I actually get most annoyed about. Any other thought? Do you have any other thoughts while I collect myself, because I lost my temper then, Dr. Brendon?
You've given a good summary. I don't have anything to add at the moment.
Okay, all right then. All right. All I would say is, oh, by the way, I thought the Martha's Vineyard, while I think the Martha's Vineyard people were really screwed over, I thought they did carry on a little bit. I know they were trying to counteract the over-the-top attack on them, but by being incredibly self-congratulating about how wonderful they were treating these people at the same time. But it was a bit ridiculous. I mean, then calling it a humanitarian crisis was a bit much. And like, I mean, they were being a bit over the top. I mean, I read an article which literally the headline was, "They enriched us. Migrants' 44-hour visit leaves indelible mark on Martha's Vineyard." You just go, oh, come on. Like, a bit much, guys. But it is just an incredibly unfair situation for the immigrants, for the Martha's Vineyard people, for everyone. My only question is, I got two questions. Number one, why didn't people talk about Greg Abbott's stunt, dropping him off at Kamala Harris's house, which in my view was actually even worse? That was just like dropping off at people's personal houses. That's bad. I know my suspicion, I'm just speculating here. I think I got two reasons, maybe. Number one, Fox News was driving the narrative, and they're very keen to promote Ron DeSantis at the moment. Trump should note that. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I suspect the media probably has more connection to Martha's Vineyard than they might to Kamala Harris's house. But anyway, do you have any thoughts about why they just ignored Greg Abbott's stunt entirely and just talked about Martha's Vineyard for the last week?
I was trying to remember where the vice president lives. It's one of those kind of obscure parts of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And the official residence is called One Observatory Circle, which doesn't really stick in the mind, but
no,
it's a little pocket of Washington, D.C., I think near the zoo from memory. And no, I mean, I think it's really interesting what you're saying about Fox News maybe wanting to be more in the DeSantis camp. You know, that why is that? That sense that, you know, that Trump is just a step too far, that January 6th leaves them kind of vulnerable for them to have problems with claiming they support democracy and all sorts of other good things?
I report, you decide, Dr. Brendon. I don't know. But the other question I have is, okay, what's this actually about? Because it's clearly not about immigration. It's about anything but immigration. DeSantis is clearly running for president. I'd like to reiterate what I've said 3 or 4 times on this podcast since we've returned, which is that DeSantis' problem, his biggest problem running for president, is that liberals don't hate him like they hate Trump. And what gets Republican voters these days, not all of them, but at least some of them, is who do the liberals hate the most? There's a rump of the Republican Party that's about 40% just resentment. And they just want to see the person that their opponents hate the most, vanquish them. And so this stunt was perfect for Ron DeSantis to make liberals hate him more. It certainly made me hate him more. I didn't have much of a problem with him until then. Oh, that's not true. I had a bit of a problem, but I have more of a problem now. But I think that's the point. That's what he wants. He wants liberals to hate him. And Abbott's been eating his lunch with the busing migrants over for the last few months to Washington and to DC, to Washington and to New York. And then DeSantis struck back. Ironically, the blatant unfairness is part of the point, because the blatant unfairness is what makes people angry. And that's what he wants. So he had to be as unfair as he possibly could with his test. He had to make it as trollish as he possibly could to make people irrationally angry with him to win votes from Republican supporters away from Trump. So it's probably a massive success. And what people should do, I would suggest, if they want to stop this escalating, because it'll keep on going at least to the election. If they want to stop this escalating, what they should do is shut up. What they should do is just take the migrants, just process them, and just shut up. Stop talking about humanitarian crises. I'm talking the blue states here. Stop talking about the whole place falling to bits. Just deal with it, because look at the reverse freedom rides. What happened to them in 1962? After a while, they just stopped because they got bored, because the liberals stopped complaining. And as soon as this is the logic of a primary school bully, which I remind you is what the mentality is. If you stop reacting, they'll get bored and move on. That's exactly what happens with primary school bullies. And I think the logic applies here. So in my view, blue states should be taking migrants anyway. I actually think if you went proportionate for population, Washington, D.C. should take about 10,000 migrants compared to the amount that have come in this year. That's how much they should take. And New York should take a hell of a lot more. And Illinois should take a hell of a lot more. California takes their share, but yeah, I actually think it's a good thing. And that if I was a blue state, I'd be contacting Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott and going, hey, we'll take more. Come on, send them. Let's do this properly. Let's do this officially so that they're actually looked after. And then let's see what happens. And if you stop complaining, they'll stop doing it. And then we can stop treating migrants like shit in this regard, at the very least. So that's my takeaway from all this. Do you have anything more to say on the topic?
No, I think you've covered it well.
Okay. All right. Now, we really are out of time here, but there are so many things we were going to talk about, which we're not going to. I'll get to COVID at some other time with Dr. Dave, and I'll get to the Inflation Reduction Act and then the courts. But I know you wanted to talk about Barbara Ehrenreich, who's died. She's not going to have died next week, at least not recently. So I'd like you to talk about her now as a way that we can end this podcast.
Sure thing. I mean, I was going to talk a bit about book banning.
Oh, you can talk about that if you want.
I'll say a little bit about that, and
okay,
then
go for it.
I'll talk about the death of one of America's great, I suppose, scholar activists, scholar journalists, sort of activists. Book banning, you might have seen a bunch of articles recently, those who follow American politics closely, particularly children's books being banned in libraries, and librarians really being at the front lines of various cultural wars, particularly in smaller towns in places like Texas and across the American South, where librarians have stood up often for children's books with a degree of nudity in them, or a degree of jokes about flatulence or toilet sort of behavior. You know,
my favorite books.
This sort of stuff is really, reminds us of that kind of prurient side of American culture where all sorts of bodily functions just can't be described. And this, to think this is really where politics has got to is pretty sad and pathetic. I mean, you're going to lead to a whole bunch of people without much of a sense of humor, but more so just that sense of comfort with people's own bodies, with the parents talking to their children about it, all of these healthy things being prohibited. And then, it goes right up, I suppose, to the Virginia governor's race last year with the attempts to get Toni Morrison's books off the curriculum, Beloved, which is a great novel, out of the schools. And, in general, I think book banning, whoever's putting it forward, is a pretty bad idea. One that don't, and is not a position I'd like anyone to be promoting. But the sort of level that it's been played out, librarians at the front lines of some of these book debates, these lists of books are extensive of what shouldn't be taught. Quite a lot of the anti-racism books are on this list. So yeah, an issue of real practicality and affecting people's lives who work as librarians. It's pretty sad. Some people losing their jobs over this, standing up for books that really are not at all sort of damaging, or certainly not promoting. Pedophilia is often this word thrown around, enormously in a lot of these discussions. And there's probably a few good articles out there for anyone who wants to be outraged about this instantly.
I will put the article that you pointed to in the reading list below so people can have a read. I should say, by the way, just to be clear, you're not talking about stopping books being taught in schools. I mean, there's obviously only so many books you can teach in a school year, and it makes sense that people be quite selective in what they teach. You're talking about books being allowed to be in a library where there's unlimited numbers of books.
Yeah, I mean, you can have arguments about the curriculum, of course, but it's the sense that, you shouldn't be reading these things because they will poison the mind. Some of the anti-racism stuff, or these children's books with nudity in them, that the sense, you could have arguments about what's the best children's book or what's the best novel for a final year English student to be studying. Of course, you can have those arguments, but it's a sense of, if you've lost the argument, or if the experts decide on something, my poor child can't read this, dramatically violent book about slavery, but they can watch, the full John Wick series anytime they want, or
Yes.
Korean movies like Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance was something my son inflicted upon me recently. I thought that's the most violent thing I've ever seen in my life. This is this is fine, but a book somewhat sort of accurately portraying slavery is not fine. Anyway, I was going to say something about Barbara Ehrenreich.
Yes, please do.
Who died on September 1 in the United States. She was the author of Nickel and Dimed. I think some people might be familiar with that book, where she worked as a tips waitress in Florida, worked cleaning people's houses, and tried to live on that for a year. That's putting yourself on the line as a journalist, as ethnographer journalist, basically. And it's a great portrayal of, I suppose, that working poor in the United States, people who work long hours, but, don't have much sort of medical coverage, certainly before the Affordable Health Care Act, just scraping by. And there's a lot of people that live like that in America. Possibly one of the reasons that all forms of immigration are not strongly pushed back in America is that, there's a lot of immigrants are doing those very rudimentary jobs in the United States. Barbara Ehrenreich wrote really sort of brilliantly about that in that book. She was her husband and her, when she was married to John Ehrenreich, came up with the term the professional managerial class. I was just reminded of that, sort of looking her up over the last couple of days. She wrote a great book in some ways, that this one here, that sort of foresees the kind of working class Republicans that Reagan appealed to, that Trump appealed to, on this basis that these people aren't really always the working poor or the sort of rural, they aren't the hillbilly allegory kind of types in West Virginia, all of them, that a lot of these people have a decent enough kind of income, 70,000 sort of family income in America, but they have the sense of a fear of falling, the status anxiety. And I think she was someone who really tapped into that, what that would do to politics when there was a white working class groups of Americans who would have that sense that it won't be as good for their children as it would for them in terms of job stability, in terms of income. And she gave a range of really sophisticated analysis of why that it was occurring, to do with managerial class, globalization, a whole range of kind of Democrat often supported politics. And she came up with solutions. It wasn't just a diagnosis. It was actually, okay, these would be some ways forward in terms of what the Democratic Party could do, what labor unions could do. And that was a book in some ways, if people had read it, some of the future might have been a bit different. And the last book of hers I'll mention, she wrote a book in the sort of mid-1980s with two favorites of the American conservative movement, Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward. They were favorites of Glenn Beck, for those who are aficionados of Fox News. And they wrote a book called Mean Season. And it was really about how the Reagan period, Reagan had a really tough attitude in California as governor. And then when he came in as president, on welfare recipients, he came up with this kind of fantasy of this woman who was a welfare queen driving a Cadillac, and sort of presented all welfare sort of recipients as dubious. And he had very strong ideas to try to really obliterate the American safety net, as limited as it was. And he didn't achieve that because the Democrats controlled the Congress, certainly the House, for his entire presidency. But with enough Southern support of Democrats, there was a real erosion of how much money was given to poor people in the United States, poor families, poor children. Child poverty in the sort of 1980s is around 26, 24% most of the time. This is alarming numbers. For those who think of the Reagan years and Reagan as, grandfatherly, and those are the good Republicans, as opposed to, these crazies that we've got now. I think Mean Season would be a book to go back and have a read and think, well, the child poverty in recent times, actually there's some quite good research showing it's declined in the United States, partly through income tax credits, income earned tax credits, some subsidies to poorer families that we've seen in the sort of last 4 or 5 years. So, there's actually the nostalgia about the 80s, I think, is quite different to the reality. And Barbara Ehrenreich was always someone who was looking out for the most vulnerable people, the people who are sort of at the bottom of American societies, and there's a lot of them, and trying to think about policies, solutions, ways that, people could pay their cleaner or or the person who looked after their children, their nanny, a decent wage. And those, I think those are still really important issues to think about.
80s nostalgia never goes out of style. Even for the Reaganism. Are there any particular policies? You said that she proposed a number of solutions. Are there any policies that we would know of now that are associated with Barbara Ehrenreich?
Yeah, I think when she died, there was a number of tributes to her saying the modern kind of living wage movement, the sort of fair wage movement, the raising the minimum wage. That was a big part of her argument, that people can't live on tips, or you're living in a very sort of unsafe trailer in Florida. So that was that sense of making those issues real. And they have got into the American labor movement. I mean, for people who have followed these issues for a long time, like myself, the idea that this minimum wage would really get to a living wage, that's a big advance. And that wasn't on the agenda in the 1980s. From 1981 to the end of the Bush senior administration, the minimum wage was frozen in the United States at $3.25.
Wow.
And so that was, a long period where it was a non-issue. And it was just, there weren't prominent advocates like Bernie Sanders and all of these kind of state governors trying to raise the minimum wage. So, Barbara Ehrenreich's a big part of that conversation of why the talk about the minimum wage eventually gets on the agenda in the United States. And, people can't live on $3.25. They couldn't back then. And so that, that has progressed.
They cannot, indeed. Well, thank you very much for stopping down to tell us about her, because I didn't know much about her, to be honest. And thank you very much for doing this podcast. I should apologize. I want to apologize to you and to our listeners that I talked more in this podcast than I've ever talked before in the podcast. This is what happens when we make us our two topics, authoritarianism and immigration, which are my two pet topics. I just go crazy. So I'm sorry about that. I really was out of control, but
no problem. I got a few things in at the beginning, and once people heard that I thought the Avengers was a 1961 British series, they really just blanked me completely and just fast forwarded to the bits where you were talking. So it was a pleasure, and it was a lot of fun to be on with you, Chaz.
If our listeners take anything out of this podcast, I want them to go to YouTube and watch the original Avengers. It was a great series, and honestly, the world would be a lot better place if we all, Dr. Brendon, only thought the Avengers as the 1960s spy caper TV series with Mrs. Peel and whatever his name is, Mr. Steed. They were the best, and they got me through my HSC as well at 2 a.m.
When you first asked me the question, I was thinking, which one is David Smith of those?
I think it was Mrs. Peel, because I think he'd rock a catsuit like it's no one's business. I would love to see that. But anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Brendon, and I really appreciate your time, and I'll see you soon, and I'll see you guys at home and on Friday. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Great to be involved.